There are places in Texas where history never feels completely gone. Places where visitors report footsteps in empty buildings, mysterious lights in the darkness, and a feeling they can't explain. Locals know these places well. In fact, many of them avoid them after dark. Not because of rumors. Not because of movies. But because of the stories that refuse to die. These are 10 of the creepiest places in Texas that locals refuse to visit after dark. Subscribe for more real horror places. 1 Yorktown Memorial Hospital. The first thing that surprised me about Yorktown Memorial Hospital was how quiet it was. I had seen photos before I arrived, but standing in front of the building felt completely different. The hospital sits in a small Texas town, and from the outside it looks frozen in time. The windows, the aging walls, and the empty grounds all create the feeling that the place has been waiting for decades for someone to return. Yorktown Memorial Hospital originally opened in the 1950s and served the local community for many years. Thousands of patients passed through its halls before it eventually closed. Like many abandoned hospitals across America, it slowly became the subject of local stories, rumors, and ghost legends. I visited during the late afternoon. The Texas sun was still visible, but long shadows had already started stretching across the property. At first, I expected the place to feel exciting. Instead, it felt strangely heavy. As I walked closer, I kept thinking about how many people had entered this building during some of the most important moments of their lives. Some arrived with hope. Some arrived in pain. Some never left. That thought stayed with me. Inside, the atmosphere was different from any abandoned house or hotel I had visited before. Hospitals are designed to be full of life, movement, and noise. When all of that disappears, the silence feels unnatural. Every hallway seemed longer than it should have been. Every room felt as though it still had a story attached to it. Local residents have shared stories about hearing unexplained voices, footsteps, and strange sounds connected to the hospital. Paranormal investigators have also reported unusual experiences over the years. None of those reports prove anything supernatural, but they have helped turn Yorktown Memorial Hospital into one of the most talked about haunted locations in Texas. While exploring the building, I found myself constantly listening. Not because I expected to hear a ghost. Because the silence was so complete that even the smallest sound felt important. A distant creak. A soft tap. The movement of air through an empty corridor. Each noise immediately pulled my attention toward it. At one point, I stopped walking entirely. For a few seconds, I thought I heard what sounded like footsteps somewhere deeper inside the building. The sound was faint. Just enough to make me wonder whether I had actually heard it. I waited. Nothing. The silence returned. A few moments later, I realized how easily abandoned places can affect the mind. When you're standing in a location filled with history and surrounded by stories you've heard beforehand, your brain begins searching for explanations for every sound and shadow. That realization didn't make the hospital feel any less unsettling. If anything, it made it more fascinating. The deeper I moved into the building, the more I found myself thinking about the people connected to it rather than the ghost stories. Every empty room had once served a purpose. Every hallway had once been crowded with nurses, doctors, patients, and families. Now there was nothing. Just dust, silence, and memories. As evening approached, the atmosphere changed again. The fading daylight made the hallways darker, and details that had been easy to see only minutes earlier started disappearing into shadow. This was the moment when I finally understood why the hospital had gained its reputation. Not because I witnessed something impossible. Not because I saw a ghost. But because the building itself tells a story. A story about time. A story about loss. A story about a place that was once filled with life and is now completely empty. When I eventually walked back outside, the sun was almost gone. I turned around one last time and looked at the hospital. For a few seconds, it stood completely still against the darkening Texas sky. No movement. No voices. No proof of anything paranormal. Yet I understood why so many people leave with questions. Yorktown Memorial Hospital doesn't need ghosts to feel haunting. Its history is enough. And sometimes, the most unsettling places are the ones that remind us how quickly even the busiest buildings can become silent. 2 Goatman's Bridge. I had heard stories about Goatman's Bridge for years before I finally decided to see it for myself. Some people called it one of the most haunted places in Texas. Others said it was nothing more than an old bridge with a scary reputation. The only way to find out what it felt like was to stand there myself. The bridge is officially known as Old Alton Bridge. It sits near Denton, Texas, crossing a quiet stretch of water surrounded by trees. During the day, it looks like a piece of local history. Built in the late 1800s, it once served travelers moving between communities. But after sunset, the atmosphere changes completely. I arrived a little before dusk. The parking area was almost empty. A light breeze moved through the trees, and the sounds of the nearby road slowly faded as I walked toward the bridge. The first thing I noticed was how isolated the place felt. Even though modern neighborhoods were not far away, the bridge seemed separated from the rest of the world. As I stepped onto the old iron structure, I could see why it had become the center of so many stories. The bridge felt old. Not just physically old. It felt as if decades of history were still hanging in the air. Many local legends connected to Goatman's Bridge focus on a black goat farmer named Oscar Washburn. According to the story, he lived in the area in the 1930s and became known for raising goats. Local folklore claims that he was later murdered by a violent mob near the bridge. Historians have found that parts of the legend are difficult to verify completely, but the story has remained part of local culture for generations. As I walked across the bridge, I kept thinking about how legends grow. Sometimes a real event happens. Then stories get passed from one generation to another. Over time, details change. Facts mix with rumors. Eventually, nobody knows exactly where history ends and folklore begins. That thought stayed in my mind while I stood in the middle of the bridge. The sun was disappearing behind the trees. The shadows were getting longer. And the forest around me was becoming quieter. At first, that silence felt peaceful. Then it started feeling different. Every sound became noticeable. The rustling of leaves. The snapping of a branch somewhere in the distance. The movement of water below. Nothing unusual was happening, but the setting made every small noise seem important. I remembered reading reports from visitors who claimed to hear footsteps when nobody else was around. Others described strange sounds coming from the woods. Paranormal investigators have spent years exploring the area, hoping to capture evidence of something unexplained. Whether those reports are true or not, standing there made me understand why people keep returning. The place creates questions. And questions are powerful. I continued walking toward the far side of the bridge. The trees looked darker now. The path ahead seemed narrower. For a moment, I glanced behind me. The bridge was empty. Completely empty. Yet I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I can't say that anything paranormal happened. I didn't see an apparition. I didn't hear a mysterious voice. But I did experience something that many visitors describe. The feeling. A feeling that someone might be watching. A feeling that your senses are working harder than usual. A feeling that makes you look over your shoulder even when there is no reason to. The longer I stayed, the stronger that feeling became. Eventually, darkness settled over the area. The bridge, which had looked historic and interesting only an hour earlier, now looked completely different. The iron structure seemed larger. The shadows seemed deeper. The woods surrounding it felt endless. That was the moment I understood the real reason Goatman's Bridge became famous. Not because everyone who visits sees something supernatural. Not because there is proven evidence of ghosts. But because the location creates an experience that stays with you. It combines real history, local folklore, and an atmosphere that naturally fuels the imagination. When I finally walked back toward my car, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The bridge stood silent in the darkness. The stories were still there. The legends were still there. And whether a person believes in ghosts or not, it's easy to understand why Goatman's Bridge remains one of the most talked about places in Texas after dark. 3. The Alamo. The first time I visited the Alamo, I expected to see a famous historic landmark. What I did not expect was the atmosphere. Almost everyone knows the Alamo because of the famous battle that took place there in 1836. It is one of the most important historic sites in Texas. Every year, thousands of people visit to learn about the defenders who fought and died during the battle. Before I arrived, I had read about the history. I knew the facts. I knew the dates. I knew the names. But standing there in person felt completely different. The city of San Antonio was busy and full of life around me. Cars moved through the streets. Tourists walked in every direction. Yet the moment I stepped closer to the Alamo grounds, it felt as if I had entered a different place entirely. The first thing that crossed my mind was simple. A lot of people died here. Not in a distant, abstract way. Right here. On this ground. That thought stayed with me as I walked through the historic site. The buildings have been preserved carefully, but history seems to linger everywhere. Every wall feels connected to a story. Every courtyard feels connected to a memory. As I moved through the grounds, I noticed visitors speaking more quietly than they had outside. Nobody was being told to lower their voice. It just happened naturally. The place seemed to command respect. Over the years, countless visitors, employees, and security staff have shared strange stories connected to the Alamo. Some have reported hearing unexplained footsteps late at night. Others have described seeing shadowy figures near historic sections of the property. There have even been reports of people claiming to hear distant sounds that resembled military activity. None of those reports prove anything supernatural. But they have become part of the site's reputation. As evening approached, I found myself thinking less about ghost stories and more about the people who had once stood there. Many of them knew they might not survive. Yet they stayed. That realization made the place feel heavier. The shadows across the courtyard began growing longer. The crowds became smaller. The noise from the city seemed farther away. For a moment, I stood near one section of the grounds and simply looked around. Nothing unusual was happening. Everything appeared normal. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that history was closer there than at any other place I had visited. Then something happened that caught my attention. I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. The sound was clear enough that I immediately turned around. Nobody was there. At first, I assumed another visitor had walked past. But the area behind me was empty. Completely empty. I listened carefully. The sound did not happen again. Maybe it had come from somewhere else. Maybe the acoustics of the old buildings carried the noise in an unexpected way. There was a logical explanation. There almost always is. Even so, the experience stayed in my mind. As darkness slowly approached, the entire atmosphere changed. The historic structures looked different. The old stone walls appeared darker. The quiet spaces between buildings felt deeper. Every detail seemed more dramatic than it had during the day. I understood why so many stories had developed around this location. Places connected to major historical events often leave a lasting impression on people. When visitors arrive knowing the history, their emotions become part of the experience. The Alamo does that better than almost anywhere else. It reminds you that history is not just something you read in books. Real people lived it. Real people fought there. Real people died there. And those facts alone are powerful enough to affect anyone who visits. As I prepared to leave, I looked back at the historic buildings one final time. The crowds had mostly disappeared. The lights around the grounds had begun to glow. For a few seconds, the entire site seemed frozen in time. No strange figure appeared. No ghost revealed itself. No mystery was solved. Yet I left with a feeling I still remember. The Alamo is unsettling not because of what people claim to see there. It is unsettling because of what undeniably happened there. The history is real. The sacrifices were real. The lives that were lost were real. And sometimes a place does not need paranormal activity to feel haunted. Sometimes the weight of history is enough. For Baker Hotel. The first thing I noticed about the Baker Hotel was that it did not look abandoned from a distance. It looked like it was waiting. Waiting for its guests to return. Waiting for its lights to come back on. Waiting for another chapter of its story to begin. I had seen photographs before visiting Mineral Wells, Texas, but none of them prepared me for the size of the building. The Baker Hotel rises above the town like something from another era. Even after decades of closure, it still dominates the skyline. As I stood there looking up at it, I found it hard to believe that this place was once one of the most famous hotels in Texas. When it opened in 1929, wealthy travelers, celebrities, and politicians visited the hotel. People came from all over the country to experience the famous mineral waters that made mineral wells popular. For years, the hotel represented luxury and success. Then time changed everything. The hotel eventually closed, and what had once been one of Texas's grandest destinations slowly became an empty landmark. That contrast was what fascinated me most. A place once filled with life had become completely silent. As I walked around the property, I kept imagining what it must have looked like during its busiest years. Cars arriving outside. Guests checking in. Music playing inside. Conversations filling the hallways. Now there was only stillness. The silence seemed to make the building feel even larger. Many local stories have developed around the Baker Hotel over the years. Some visitors have reported unexplained sounds. Others have claimed to see strange figures near windows. Paranormal investigators have spent years exploring the building, hoping to document something unusual. Whether those stories are true or not, they have become part of the hotel's identity. And standing there, it was easy to understand why. The building has a presence. A feeling that is difficult to explain. As evening approached, the sunlight began fading from the upper floors. The shadows slowly climbed the walls, and the hotel started looking less like a historic building and more like a forgotten monument. I remember staring at one row of windows. Most were dark. Most were empty. Yet I kept finding myself looking back toward them. There was no movement. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was watching the town as much as the town was watching it. That thought stayed with me. The longer I remained there, the more questions I found myself asking. How many people had stayed there? How many important conversations had happened inside those rooms? How many stories had started there? And how many had ended there? The history of the hotel felt bigger than the building itself. As darkness continued to settle over the area, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The details that had been visible during daylight slowly disappeared. The upper floors blended into the night sky. The windows became black rectangles. The hotel seemed larger than before. For a moment, I understood why so many ghost stories surround the place. Not because I witnessed anything supernatural. Not because I saw a ghostly figure in a window. But because the building naturally fuels the imagination. When people see a structure that large sitting empty for decades, their minds begin filling in the missing pieces. Every dark window becomes a possibility. Every shadow becomes a question. Every unexplained sound becomes a mystery. At one point, I heard a noise echo somewhere nearby. I stopped immediately. The sound was brief. Just enough to make me pay attention. I listened carefully. Nothing followed. A few seconds later, I realized it could have been almost anything. The wind. A distant vehicle. A loose piece of material shifting somewhere around the property. There was a logical explanation. Yet the moment still created tension. And that tension was exactly what made the experience memorable. The Baker Hotel has a way of making ordinary things feel significant. By the time I prepared to leave, the hotel stood almost completely surrounded by darkness. Only a few nearby lights illuminated parts of the structure. The rest seemed lost in shadow. I looked back one final time before walking away. The building appeared exactly as it had when I arrived. Silent. Motionless. Empty. Yet it somehow felt different. Maybe it was because I now understood its story better. The Baker Hotel is not unsettling because of proven paranormal activity. It is unsettling because it represents the passage of time. A place that once welcomed thousands of people now stands as a reminder of how quickly things can change. And when you stand beneath it after dark, surrounded by silence and history, it becomes very easy to understand why so many legends continue to grow around its walls. 5. Jefferson Hotel. I had been hearing about the Jefferson Hotel for a long time before I finally visited Jefferson, Texas. Most people know the town for its history. The streets, old buildings, and preserved architecture make it feel as if part of Texas never moved on from the 19th century. But the more I researched the area, the more one name kept appearing over and over again. The Jefferson Hotel. Some people talked about its history. Others talked about its ghosts. I was interested in both. When I first saw the building, it immediately felt different from modern hotels. The structure looked old in a way that photographs never fully capture. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't ruined. It was still standing proudly after generations of visitors had come and gone. That was what caught my attention. Thousands of people had slept there. Thousands of conversations had happened inside those walls. And somehow the building had survived it all. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. The noise from outside faded away. The interior felt quiet. Not empty. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every sound around you. The hotel dates back to the 19th century and has become one of the most famous historic hotels in Texas. Over the years, countless guests have stayed there, and with that history came stories. Visitors have reported strange experiences for decades. Some claim to hear footsteps in empty hallways. Others report unexplained sounds coming from vacant rooms. None of those stories prove anything paranormal. But they are part of the hotel's reputation. And when you're standing inside the building, it's easy to understand why. As I walked through the hallways, I kept noticing details that connected the present to the past. Old photographs. Historic features. Small reminders that people had been living, traveling, and passing through this hotel long before any of us were born. That realization made the place feel alive. Not because of ghosts. Because of history. Still, as the evening continued, the atmosphere slowly shifted. The hallways seemed longer. The shadows seemed darker. The silence became more noticeable. At one point, I found myself stopping near a staircase. I wasn't reacting to anything specific. I simply had the strange feeling that I should stop and listen. So I did. For a few moments, everything was completely still. Then I heard a sound. A faint creak somewhere above me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shocking. It sounded like an old building settling. Yet the timing of it immediately caught my attention. I looked toward the upper floor. Nothing moved. Nobody appeared. The hallway remained silent. A few seconds later, I laughed at myself. Old hotels make sounds. Wood expands and contracts. Floors creak. There was probably a simple explanation. But even after reaching that conclusion, I noticed something interesting. My attention had changed. Now I was listening to every sound. Every footstep. Every distant noise. Every small movement. The building had pulled me into its atmosphere. And that atmosphere was powerful. Later, while learning more about the hotel's past, I discovered why so many visitors leave with stories of their own. Historic locations have a unique effect on people. When you know that generations of travelers walked the same halls, your imagination naturally becomes more active. Every closed door seems mysterious. Every empty corridor seems significant. Every unexplained sound feels important. The Jefferson Hotel creates exactly that experience. As darkness settled outside, the historic building felt even older than before. The modern world seemed farther away. The hotel no longer felt like a tourist destination. It felt like a place suspended between different eras. That was probably the most unsettling part of the visit. Not fear. Not ghosts. The feeling that time itself was layered inside the building. The people who stayed there decades ago were gone. Yet traces of their presence seemed to remain in the atmosphere. When I eventually stepped outside, the streets of Jefferson were quiet. The hotel stood behind me exactly as it had for generations. Still. Silent. Unchanged. I turned around for one final look before leaving. No mysterious figure appeared in a window. No paranormal event revealed itself. Nothing happened that could not be explained. Yet the experience stayed with me. Because the Jefferson Hotel doesn't rely on jump scares or ghost stories to leave an impression. Its history does most of the work. The stories, the legends, and the atmosphere simply build upon that foundation. And when you combine a century of history with a building that seems frozen in time, you end up with a place that feels haunting long before anyone mentions the word ghost. 6 Hotel Galvez. When I first arrived in Galveston, I understood immediately why so many people fall in love with the city. The ocean was only a short distance away. The air carried the smell of saltwater, and the historic buildings gave the area a character that felt different from anywhere else in Texas. But there was one building I had come to see. Hotel Galvez. I had seen photographs countless times before visiting, but standing in front of it was something else entirely. The hotel looked elegant, almost timeless. It had been watching over the Gulf Coast for more than a century, surviving storms, changing generations, and the constant movement of time. At first glance, nothing about it seemed frightening. That was what surprised me. Most places with haunted reputations looked dark or abandoned. Hotel Galvez looked beautiful. Yet the more I learned about its history, the more I understood why it had become one of the most talked about locations in Texas. The hotel opened in 1911 and quickly became one of the most important landmarks in Galveston. Over the decades, thousands of guests passed through its doors. Soldiers stayed there during wartime. Travelers arrived from across the country. Weddings, celebrations, and life-changing moments all happened within its walls. With that much history, stories were inevitable. One story appears more often than any other. It involves a woman known as the Lovelorn Lady. According to local legend, a young woman stayed at the hotel while waiting for her fiancé, who was working at sea. The story claims that she received news that his ship had been lost and that tragedy followed soon afterward. Over the years, many visitors have connected unexplained experiences at the hotel to that legend. Whether every detail is true or not, the story has become part of the hotel's identity. Knowing that history changed the way I looked at the building. As I walked through the lobby, everything felt normal. Guests checked in. People talked quietly. Staff members moved through the hotel. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet I kept thinking about how many people had stood in the same place before me. More than 100 years of memories were connected to those hallways. That thought stayed with me as I explored the property. The afternoon slowly turned into evening. The sunlight outside became softer. The shadows inside became longer. The atmosphere began changing in subtle ways. Nothing dramatic happened. The hotel simply felt older. Its history became easier to notice. At one point, I found myself standing near a hallway that was noticeably quieter than the rest of the building. The sounds of conversation from the lobby had faded. The ocean breeze outside was barely audible. For a few moments, I simply stood there listening. Then I heard something. A door closing somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed briefly through the corridor. I looked around instinctively. Nobody was nearby. Of course, hotels are full of guests. Someone could easily have entered a room out of sight. There was nothing mysterious about it. Still, the moment caught my attention because of how quiet everything had become. For the rest of the evening, I found myself noticing every small detail. Every sound. Every movement. Every shadow. That is something many people don't mention when they talk about historic locations. The atmosphere changes the way you observe the world around you. The more history a place carries, the more aware you become of your surroundings. As darkness settled outside, the lights of the hotel reflected softly against the historic walls. Looking out toward the Gulf, I imagined how different the area must have looked a century earlier. Ships crossing the horizon. Travelers arriving by train. Families beginning vacations. People creating memories they never imagined would become part of history. The realization was strangely emotional. The building was not just preserving architecture. It was preserving stories. Some joyful. Some tragic. Some completely forgotten. By the time I prepared to leave, I understood why Hotel Galvez has maintained its reputation for so many years. Not because I witnessed a ghost. Not because I experienced something impossible. But because the hotel creates a feeling that is difficult to describe. Its history feels close. Its past feels present. And when you combine a century of real events, local legends, and a building that has watched generations come and go, the result is naturally haunting. As I walked away, I turned back for one final look. The hotel stood illuminated against the night sky, overlooking the Gulf exactly as it had for decades. Silent. Beautiful. Unchanged. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the most haunting places are not the ones where something unexplained happens. They are the places where history itself refuses to be forgotten. 7. Presidio La Bahía. I had visited historic sites before, but none of them prepared me for what I felt at Presidio La Bahía. The drive to Galvez, Texas, was quiet. The roads became less crowded, and the modern world slowly seemed to fade behind me. By the time I reached the old fort, the first thing I noticed was how isolated it felt. The structure stood under the Texas sky almost exactly where it had stood for centuries. That alone was enough to get my attention. Many historic locations tell stories. Presidio La Bahía feels like it remembers them. As I walked closer, I thought about its history. The fort dates back to the Spanish colonial era and played a major role in Texas history. But the event most people remember is the Galvez massacre of 1836. Hundreds of Texan prisoners were executed after being captured during the Texas Revolution. Unlike many historical events that feel distant when you read about them, this one felt immediate. The reason was simple. I was standing where it happened. That realization followed me everywhere as I explored the grounds. The stone walls looked strong even after all these years. The courtyards were peaceful. Birds could be heard in the distance. Everything appeared calm. Yet the history beneath that calm atmosphere was impossible to ignore. I remember stopping near one section of the fort and simply looking around. Tourists often talk about beautiful historic locations. This was different. The place was beautiful, but it also carried a weight that was difficult to explain. The kind of feeling that makes you lower your voice without realizing it. The kind of feeling that reminds you that real people once stood exactly where you are standing. People who had hopes, fears, and plans for the future. People who never got to see that future. As the afternoon continued, I learned more about the stories connected to the fort. Over the years, visitors and employees have reported unusual experiences. Some claim to hear footsteps when nobody is nearby. Others describe unexplained sounds or the feeling of being watched. There is no scientific proof that these reports are paranormal. But after spending time there, I understood why such stories continue. The history itself creates an atmosphere unlike almost anywhere else. As the sun began dropping lower, the shadows inside the fort became longer. The stone walls changed color in the fading light. The open spaces seemed quieter. The fort felt older. Much older. For a few moments, I sat alone and listened. The wind moved gently through the area. Nothing else. No voices. No movement. Just silence. Then I noticed something unexpected. The silence itself was unsettling. Most places have background noise. Traffic. Conversations. The sound of modern life. At Presidio La Bahía, there were moments when it felt as if time had paused. And during those moments, my thoughts naturally returned to the events of 1836. I found myself imagining the uncertainty the prisoners must have felt. The fear. The confusion. The realization that something terrible was about to happen. Those thoughts were difficult to shake. The closer evening came, the stronger that feeling became. I wasn't frightened by ghosts. I was affected by history. And sometimes history can be more powerful than any ghost story. As darkness slowly approached, the fort became even more impressive. The old stone walls stood against the changing sky exactly as they had for generations. Wars had come and gone. Empires had risen and fallen. Entire lifetimes had passed. Yet the fort remained. That persistence made the place feel almost timeless. I took one final walk across the grounds before leaving. The area was nearly empty. The quietness returned. And once again, I found myself looking around without any particular reason. There was no strange figure. No unexplained voice. Nothing that could be described as paranormal. Yet the atmosphere remained unforgettable. By the time I reached my car, I realized why Presidio La Bahía stays with so many visitors long after they leave. It is not because of what people claim to see there. It is because of what undeniably happened there. The events connected to the fort are real. The people who lost their lives there were real. The history is real. And when a place carries that much history, it doesn't need legends to feel haunted. The truth is already powerful enough. Long after I left Goliad, I could still picture those stone walls standing quietly beneath the Texas sky, guarding memories that time has never completely erased. 8. Bragg Road Ghost Light. The first time I heard about the Bragg Road Ghost Light, I thought it sounded like every other small-town ghost story. A mysterious light appears at night. Nobody can fully explain it. Locals talk about it for generations. Visitors drive for hours hoping to see it. I had heard stories like that before. Most of them sounded interesting until you actually visited the place. Then reality usually took over. That was exactly what I expected when I drove toward Bragg Road near Saratoga, Texas. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The area was quiet. The road stretched through dense woods. There were no large buildings nearby. No tourist attractions. No dramatic landmarks. Just a lonely road surrounded by trees. That simplicity made the story even more interesting. People had been reporting strange lights there for more than a century. Some claimed the light belonged to a railroad worker carrying a lantern. Others believed it was connected to a tragic accident from long ago. There were also people who suggested scientific explanations involving atmospheric conditions, vehicle headlights, or natural light reflections. The truth is that nobody has completely settled the mystery. That uncertainty was exactly why I wanted to see the place myself. I arrived shortly before sunset. The last traces of daylight were fading through the trees. The road already felt isolated. As darkness slowly took over, the atmosphere changed in a way that photographs never capture. The woods became deeper. The silence became heavier. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. A branch snapping somewhere in the distance immediately caught my attention. The wind moving through the trees sounded almost like whispers. I kept reminding myself that nothing unusual was happening. It was just a dark road. Yet I found myself paying attention to every detail around me. As the sky turned black, more visitors arrived. That surprised me. Some people had traveled long distances just for a chance to see the light. Many of them had heard stories from parents or grandparents who had visited years earlier. The mystery had survived across generations. That alone was fascinating. We waited. At first, nothing happened. Minutes passed. The road remained dark. The forest remained silent. Then someone pointed into the distance. A small light had appeared. It was far away. Very far away. At first I thought it might be a vehicle. But the light did not behave the way I expected. It seemed to hover. Then it shifted. Then it appeared to grow brighter. Several people around me noticed it at the same time. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Everyone simply watched. The strange thing was not that the light existed. The strange thing was how difficult it was to understand. Every time I thought I knew what I was looking at, the appearance changed. The light seemed closer. Then farther away. Brighter. Then dimmer. I remember staring at it and trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. There probably was. Most mysteries eventually have one. Yet standing there in the darkness, surrounded by people who were seeing the same thing, the experience felt different from reading about it online. The mystery felt real. That was the moment I understood why the legend had survived for so long. People do not return because they are guaranteed to see a ghost. They return because they leave with questions. Questions are powerful. Questions stay with you. As the light eventually faded from view, the road became dark again. The silence returned. The forest looked exactly the same as before. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. Everyone was thinking about what they had just seen. Some believed it was a natural phenomenon. Others believed it was something stranger. Nobody had a definitive answer. And maybe that was the point. As I prepared to leave, I looked one last time down the dark stretch of Bragg Road. The trees stood motionless on both sides. The mystery remained exactly where it had always been. Waiting for the next visitor. Waiting for the next explanation. Waiting for the next story. I drove away without proof of anything supernatural. I did not encounter a ghost. I did not witness something impossible. But I did experience one of Texas's most famous unsolved legends. And long after the road disappeared in my rearview mirror, I found myself thinking about that distant light. Not because I knew what it was. But because I didn't. 9 Marfa Lights Viewing Area. I had heard about the Marfa Lights for years before I finally made the trip to West Texas. The strange thing was that nobody seemed to agree on what the lights actually were. Some people believed they were caused by atmospheric effects. Others blamed distant vehicle headlights. And then there were those who insisted that no scientific explanation could fully account for what they had seen. The more I researched the mystery, the more curious I became. Eventually curiosity won. I found myself driving across the wide-open landscape of West Texas toward the small town of Marfa. The journey itself felt unusual. The road stretched endlessly across the desert. Mountains appeared in the distance. The sky seemed larger than anywhere else I had ever been. It was beautiful. But it was also isolated. The farther I traveled, the more it felt like I was leaving the modern world behind. By the time I reached the Marfa Lights viewing area, the sun was already beginning to set. Several other visitors were there as well. That immediately caught my attention. Some had cameras. Some had binoculars. Others were simply standing quietly, looking toward the horizon. Many of them had driven hundreds of miles for exactly the same reason I had. They wanted answers. The mystery of the Marfa Lights has existed for well over a century. Reports date back to the 19th century, long before modern highways and vehicle traffic reached the area. Over the decades, ranchers, travelers, scientists, and tourists have all reported seeing unusual lights in the distance. The fact that the reports came from so many different people was part of what made the story so fascinating. As darkness slowly settled over the desert, the atmosphere changed completely. The daytime heat faded. The sky darkened. The distant mountains became silhouettes. And the enormous Texas landscape seemed even larger than before. At first, nothing happened. People waited. Some talked quietly. Others stared toward the horizon without saying a word. I remember checking the distance repeatedly, wondering if I had traveled all this way for nothing. Then someone nearby pointed. A small light had appeared far away. For a moment I assumed it was a vehicle. That seemed like the obvious explanation. But then the light changed. It grew brighter. Then dimmer. Then appeared to move. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me question what I was seeing. Several other people noticed it at exactly the same time. Nobody seemed certain about what they were looking at. That uncertainty created an unusual feeling. The light wasn't frightening. It wasn't threatening. It was mysterious. And mystery has a way of capturing attention more effectively than almost anything else. The longer I watched, the stranger the experience became. At times the light seemed fixed in one position. Then suddenly it appeared somewhere else. Sometimes it looked larger. Other times it looked as if it might disappear entirely. Every time I thought I understood it, something changed. That was the moment I realized why the Marfa Lights had remained famous for so long. The phenomenon refuses to give people a simple answer. People naturally remember unanswered questions. I found myself completely focused on the horizon. Minutes passed without me noticing. The desert around me had become almost silent. The darkness felt endless. The lights continued appearing and fading in the distance. I knew there were scientific theories. Some researchers have connected certain sightings to vehicle headlights and atmospheric conditions. Other explanations involve temperature layers in the air that can distort distant light sources. Those explanations may account for many sightings. Perhaps even most of them. Yet standing there in person felt different from reading explanations online. The experience itself was what mattered. The feeling of seeing something unusual and realizing that thousands of other people had stood in the same spot asking the same questions. As the evening continued, the lights eventually became harder to see. Some visitors packed their equipment and left. Others remained, hoping for one final appearance. I stayed a little longer. Partly because I was curious. Partly because I didn't want the experience to end. Eventually I turned toward my car. Before leaving, I looked back at the dark horizon one final time. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. The mystery remained exactly where it had always been. Unsolved. Unexplained. Waiting. I left Marfa without proof of anything supernatural. I didn't see a ghost. I didn't witness anything impossible. But I did understand why people continue making the journey. Because some mysteries survive not because nobody has tried to explain them. They survive because even after hearing every explanation, people still want to see them for themselves. And standing there in the darkness of West Texas, watching distant lights dance across the horizon, I finally understood why the Marfa Lights have fascinated visitors for generations. 10 Miss Molly's Hotel. When I first arrived in Fort Worth Stockyards District, I expected history. What I did not expect was how alive that history would feel. The streets were full of old Western character. Wooden storefronts, historic buildings, and the feeling that parts of the city had somehow escaped the rush of time. It was easy to understand why tourists came there. But one building kept attracting my attention. Miss Molly's Hotel. From the outside, it looked smaller than many of the famous haunted hotels I had visited. There were no towering walls or massive entrances. It looked simple. Almost ordinary. Yet the more I learned about its past, the more interesting it became. The building has existed in one form or another since the early days of the stockyards. Over the years it served different purposes and witnessed generations of visitors passing through the area. Like many old buildings, its history became mixed with stories, legends, and unexplained reports. That combination was exactly why I wanted to see it. As I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. Not in a dramatic way. Nothing supernatural happened. But the building felt old in the best possible sense. The wooden floors, narrow hallways, and historic details created the feeling that every room had a story attached to it. I remember thinking about how many people had stayed there over the decades. Travelers. Workers. Families. People whose names would never appear in history books. Yet all of them had left traces of their lives behind. That thought followed me throughout the visit. One thing that stood out was how much history seemed packed into such a relatively small space. Some buildings impress you because of their size. Miss Molly's Hotel impressed me because of its character. Every corner felt connected to another era. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me that the building had survived for generations. Over the years, guests have shared stories about unusual experiences at the hotel. Some describe hearing footsteps. Others report strange sounds during the night. A few visitors have claimed to notice things they could not easily explain. Whether those experiences have ordinary explanations or not, they have become part of the hotel's reputation. And after spending time there, I could understand why. As the afternoon turned into evening, the atmosphere became noticeably different. The busy sounds from outside began fading. The hallways grew quieter. The shadows became longer. The building seemed older. Not physically older. Emotionally older. The history became easier to feel. At one point, I found myself sitting quietly and simply listening. That might sound strange, but historic places often reveal themselves best when you stop moving. For several minutes, I heard almost nothing. Then a faint creak echoed somewhere inside the building. I looked up immediately. The sound disappeared. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. Logically, there was nothing unusual about it. Old wooden buildings make sounds all the time. Temperature changes. Settling materials. Normal structural movement. Yet the timing of the sound instantly captured my attention. That was something I noticed throughout the visit. The building seemed to make you more aware of everything around you. Every sound felt important. Every shadow attracted attention. Every small detail seemed meaningful. The atmosphere encouraged curiosity. And curiosity naturally creates tension. As darkness settled outside, I walked through the hotel one final time. The historic rooms looked different than they had during the day. The lighting was softer. The hallways seemed narrower. The silence seemed deeper. For a brief moment, I imagined what the building must have looked like decades earlier. Guests arriving late at night. Conversations drifting through open doors. People sharing stories before going to sleep. Life filling every corner of the hotel. Now most of that existed only in memory. That realization was surprisingly emotional. The building had witnessed countless moments that were important to the people who lived them. Most of those moments have been forgotten by the world. Yet somehow the hotel remained. As I prepared to leave, I paused outside and looked back one final time. The building stood quietly beneath the Texas night. Nothing unusual happened. No mystery revealed itself. No ghost appeared in a window. Yet I left with a feeling that stayed with me long afterward. Miss Molly's hotel is not unsettling because of proven paranormal activity. It is unsettling because history feels close there. The stories, the legends, and the atmosphere all grow from that foundation. When a place survives long enough, it becomes more than a building. It becomes a collection of memories. And sometimes those memories are powerful enough to make a place feel haunted, even when no one can prove why.